left off, because what we're going to see is that we've come to the conclusion of the first part of the book of Ezra. So Ezra is broken down really into two parts. Chapters 1 through 6 encompass a period of about 28 years. And it starts with King Cyrus saying that it's okay for these Jews who have been in captivity in Babylon to return to Jerusalem. And he allows them to return. And this is just an incredible favor that you don't see kings normally do. And we talked in the beginning of our classes about how Cyrus was probably shown his name in the Hebrew Scriptures, written, long hundreds of years before he was even born. And this was probably one of the things that prompted him to say, you know what, this has got to be, from above. I need to do something for these people. And so they come back, and in the first 6 chapters, we read about the opposition that the Jews faced once they got back to Jerusalem. The opposition to rebuilding the temple. The people that were there were worried that all of a sudden this nation that had been in captivity for 70 years is back, and they're going to be a threat to that local area. So they opposed the building of the temple, and after a number of years where it lay dormant, and I think that's what, Pete, you covered last week, how the people's priorities were wrong. They were taking the wood that had been likely used for the purpose of the temple, and they were putting that into their homes, these paneled houses that Haggai talked about. And so last week, I think what Pete did is he talked about how the prophets came and they encouraged the people to get back to the work. And they did. And they rebuilt the temple. And we saw that after 21 years after Cyrus' decree, the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, and they finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. And so we have a happy ending. But that's just the first part of the book. That's the ending to the first section of Ezra. And what happens next is in chapter 7, we're introduced to Ezra. And it's really quite interesting because there is a period, they say, of about 58 years between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. So think about that. The first 6 chapters take place over 21 years. Then there's a gap of 58 years before Ezra comes on the scene. And yet, the book is named after Ezra. Doesn't that seem odd? You've got Zerubbabel and Jeshua who bring all these people back to the city. They went, what did we say it was, 1,000 miles? And they come all the way back to Jerusalem. It's Zerubbabel and Jeshua who rebuild the temple with the people, and yet the book is named after Ezra. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about why I think that's the case. But just keep that in mind. It's an interesting, conundrum. Why is it that Ezra is named why is it the book is named after Ezra? So we're introduced to Ezra here in chapter 7, and there are a few things that I think are important. The first thing is that Ezra's lineage is just impeccable. So for the Jews, do you remember in those first few chapters there were these genealogies? Talked about all the people that came back to the land, and it gave this very intricate, detailed record of whose son was who, and that was a really important thing in Israel. But when we look at Ezra, we're going to see that he is a direct descendant of Moses' brother, Aaron. I mean, he goes right back to the very first of the high priests. And this is going to be an important lesson for us because what they've done is they've now built the temple, and the temple is there, and it's operational. And Ezra is in Babylon 58 years after the building has been done, and he's looking back and he says, these people need help. Now, who better to help in the running of the temple than the one who is directly connected to Aaron the high priest and all the high priests that came after Aaron? So he is one of impeccable lineage. Now, turn to Ezra chapter 7, and we'll just read a few parts from this particular chapter. And the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to take a look at the first couple of verses. So Ezra chapter 7, verse 1. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Seraiah, the son of Azariah, and here you see his lineage, go down to verse 5, the son of Abishua, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the chief priest. This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And in verse 6 here, we see this interesting expression. It says, the king had granted him everything he asked for the hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. Everything he asked for. Now, I think most of us are probably familiar with Nehemiah, who came later. But Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. And Nehemiah had access to the king of Persia, which is just a remarkable thing, that this Jew would have access to the king of kings, as they said, as the Persian kings described themselves. But what's fascinating to me is it wasn't just Nehemiah. It was Ezra too. Ezra had access to the king. Let's not lose sight of the fact that that was unique. That's something that most normal people wouldn't have access to. And somehow, he was able to have access. I think we're going to talk a moment about why I think that's the case. The next thing we see is that Ezra really was devoted to the law. So it says there in verse 6, he was a teacher well versed in the law of Moses. And then when we come down to verse 10, it says, for Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. And this, brothers and sisters, is the reason I think Ezra came back. He understood the scriptures. He understood the law better than anybody else. And he was devoted not only to understanding it, but what else? To teaching it. And this was so important because remember, these people had been in captivity for 70 years. There was no temple. Now the temple's been built. They have no idea what they're doing. Who's going to teach them how to worship the Lord their God in the way that God had asked them to worship him? Well, they need someone who's well-versed in the law in order to do that. Ezra, I think, is looking back on these 58 years and says, these people need help. So it's 58 years after the completion of the temple. Ezra the scribe returns to Jerusalem with the full support of the Persian king, King Artaxerxes. And we read about that in verses 12 and 13. And these are the beginning verses of this letter that was written. It's this letter of recommendation. And it's this letter that Ezra would carry that would show to the people that he comes with the full support of the King of Kings, Artaxerxes. This is a copy of the letter, verse 11, that King Artaxerxes had given Ezra the priest and teacher, a man learned in matters concerning the commands and decrees of the Lord of Israel. Artaxerxes, verse 12, King of Kings, to Ezra the priest, a teacher of the law of the God of heaven, greetings. Verse 13, now I decree that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including priests and Levites, who wish to go to Jerusalem with you, may go. So why the priests and Levites? What was their role? Well, their role was directly connected to the worship in the temple. Remember, a priest was a Levite, but not all Levites were priests. Priests were descendant from Aaron, but not all of the members of the Levitical tribe were of Aaron's family. So those who weren't priests were told in scriptures that they were to assist the Levites in the worship and in the management of the temple. And what Artaxerxes is doing now is he's saying that the priests and the Levites can return. So there's this incredibly, we see this incredible support of the king. And the question is, why? What is it that would have happened that would have caused this great support from the Persian Empire to this minority of all peoples? And the answer, I think, is found in the book of Esther. Remember, all of these books, we don't see them chronologically in our Old Testament. But when we put them together in chronological order, we see that they sort of finger lock. And we had looked at this in one of our earlier classes, how Ezra and how Esther and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, these are 6 books in the Scriptures that are all centered around this same small time period. And so we can go to all of these different books and get a fuller view of what was happening in Israel in those days. And we can go to Esther, and we can see that what's happening in Esther has a direct impact on what is occurring now with Ezra the high priest. And what happened was this. Remember, Haman was so opposed to Mordecai in the book of Esther that he issued this decree that said that all the Jews would be what? They'd be annihilated. They'd be annihilated. And then a search was made, and they discovered that, this was a wrong thing to do. We need to reward the Jews. And there was this favor then that was passed on to the Jews. And I want to just bring you there to Esther chapter 10. And this is the last chapter in the book of Esther, but it sort of sums up what's happening. So Esther chapter 10, it comes right after Nehemiah. And what we're reading about here is King Xerxes. This is the father of Artaxerxes. So Xerxes comes first, and his son is Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the one that we're reading about in the book of Ezra. But before him, Xerxes was there. Xerxes was the king in Persia when Esther was around, when Mordecai and Haman had this great conflict. And listen to chapter 10. We'll read the chapter. It's just 3 verses. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to the distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, the Jew, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews. Now just pause there. We asked the question earlier, how was it that Ezra had access to the king? He was a Jew. And Mordecai came before him. And Mordecai paved the way so that people like Ezra and people like Nehemiah would be under the favor of the Persian Empire. And this chapter here in Esther expands on that. So first we see that Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, held in high esteem by his many fellow workers because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. And I think that what Mordecai has done now, having access to the King Xerxes, is he's paved the way for other Jews to follow. And that, brothers and sisters, is why Nehemiah and Ezra have access to the king. That is why Ezra was able to devote himself to the studying of the Scriptures. That's why he was given the benefit by the king to return to the land. And so we're finally introduced to Ezra in chapter 7 of the book that bears his name. Now, when we think about what we're reading here in Esther, yes, it is a result of what Mordecai had done to sort of pave the way. It said that Mordecai worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. But make no mistake, brothers and sisters, it's not just Mordecai's work. The reality is, it's the hand of God that works in the kingdom of men. It's the hand of God that smoothed the way. More than anything that Mordecai the man did, God was directly involved in what we see here. And so here is 6 different passages from the book of Ezra, plus another passage from an early chapter in Nehemiah that show and specifically state that the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. So let's just take a look at a couple of these. So we're in Ezra chapter 7, and in verse 6 is what we've just read. The king granted Ezra all that he asked for because the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. Verse 9, Ezra began to go up from Babylon and came to Jerusalem, for the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. The end of the chapter, Ezra took courage before the king and his men and gathered leading men to go with him, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. And throughout the book, we see this emphasis, this theme, that God's hand is involved. It's not a coincidence. It's not just the work of what's the word I'm looking for? This leader, this Mordecai, this guy that's just a passionate speaker of some sort, that he can get everybody together. God was involved. God rules in the kingdom of men. And I think that's the lesson there. So let's now look back to Ezra chapter 7. Any questions so far or comments? Okay. So we're in Ezra chapter 7. Artaxerxes, descendant, has now given Ezra the ability to go back to the land. We see in chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, down to the 26th verse of this letter that he's written. He says in the 13th verse, the king says, I decree that any Israelite in my kingdom, including priests and Levites who wish to go to Jerusalem with you, may go. And so what we're going to see now is Ezra getting all the people together. And he's staging them. They come to this place called the Ahava Canal. And it's there that they all meet and they get together and they prepare now to take this 800-mile journey on foot through a very difficult passageway to get there. And it's a worrisome thing for the people, because not only was he given permission to go, but do you remember what else happened? What else did the king do for him? Say it again?
Gold.
Yeah. He rewarded him with all sorts of gifts to bring back to use in the service of the temple. Now, they are leaving, and they're traveling across hostile land without a guard, without any, weapons, and they are at the mercy of, all of the people who they might come across. And so they're getting together and they're talking about this journey that they're to go on. So let's just take a look at that. We're going to be in chapter 8. And chapter 8 begins with the first 14 verses of him listing all of these people that are going to go with him. There are over 1,000 people now that are returning. Chapter 8, verse 15. I assembled them at the canal that flows towards Ahava. And we camped there 3 days. And when I checked among the people and the priests, I found no Levites there. So the question is, where are the Levites? Where are the Levites? Turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 23. Chronicles, by the way, was likely written by Ezra. And it was probably written to encourage these people as they were trying to reform what was happening in the land. And so in Chronicles, we see Hezekiah, reforming what's happening in Israel. And we see the Levites play a huge role in the book of the Chronicles. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 23, we read about the size, the number of Levites that were involved in temple service. So we're going to look at the first three verses 3 through 5. We there, 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verses 3 through 5. Remember now, the Levites their purpose is to assist the priests in the service of the temple. The Levites, 30 years old or more, were counted, and the total number of men was 38,000. David said, of these, 24,000 are to supervise the work of the temple of the Lord, and 6,000 are to be officials and judges, 4,000 are to be gatekeepers, 4,000 are to praise the Lord with the musical instruments. So in David's day, not many years before, there were 38,000 Levites, 24,000 of whom, over 60%, were working in the service of the temple. And now we come to them by the Ahava Canal. They're going back for the specific purpose of doing work in the temple, which has finally been built. And Ezra looks around. He says, there's no Levites here. What the heck is going on? Where are the Levites? Back to Ezra. We're in verse 15. I assembled them at the canal that flows toward Ahava, and we camped there 3 days. And when I checked among the people and the priests, I found no Levites there. So I summoned Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jarib, in this list of people. Men who were of learning, it says at the end of verse 16. And I sent them to Iddo, the leader, in Casiphia. And I told them what to say to Iddo and his kinsmen, the temple servants in Casiphia, so that they might bring attendance to us for the house of God. So he's got to go and he needs to recruit people. He needs to find these Levites. So the question is, where have they been? And I think the answer is probably, if you think about it, somewhat obvious. They've been in captivity for 70 years. The only thing the Levites were to do was what? To work in the service of the temple. There's no temple in Babylon. It's now 58 years even later than that. So for 130 years, the Levites have not had a role in Israel to perform. And as a result, they have intermingled with the rest of the tribes. They don't have a specific role anymore. They don't understand their role. They've been assimilated into the tribes. And what happens is Ezra has to search them out. Verse 17, I sent them to Iddo, the leader in Casiphia, and I told them what to say to Iddo and his kinsmen, the temple servants. Verse 18, here we see it again. Because the gracious hand of our God was on us, they brought us Sherebiah, a capable man from the descendants of Mahali, son of Levi and son of Israel. And Sherebiah's sons and brothers, 18 men. And Hazabiah, together with Jerahiah and the descendants of Merari and his brothers and nephews, 20 men. So there are 38 Levites that have been discovered, that have come back. So he discovers there's no Levites. He searches for them. Only 38 show up. Of the 1,000 people that are returning with Ezra, that's only 2.5%. And if you go back to the beginning of Ezra, where we read about the first wave of exiles that returned, It tells us there were 42,000 exiles that came back. And when you look at the details, it tells us that of those 42,000, there were only 341 Levites. That's less than 1% of the returning refugees, exiles. Only 0.8% were from the Levitical tribe. So again, the question is, where did they go? And the answer is, they lost their way. And what we're going to see is that there is this interdependence, this spiritual interdependence that is required. We talk about unity in the body. This is a lesson that we hear about in the New Testament time and time again. The Apostle Paul talks about the body of Christ and how we are all made up of many members. And we might think that, I don't have a very important position in the ecclesia. What I do isn't really all that important. But it is. Because we all perform our own roles. And when one role drops off, it impacts everybody else. And this is what we see happening in Israel. So when things are working well in the Old Testament, we find that the people, they are faithful and they are obedient. And based on this national faith, based on this national obedience, God says in Deuteronomy that they will be blessed. And that's one of the things I think, Pete, you covered last week, was the blessings and the cursings. So in periods where the nation, not individually, but periods when the nation is faithful, God tells them that they will be blessed. And when they are blessed, their crops grow. And when their crops grow, it means that they have sufficient in their mind to provide the tithes and the holy provisions that are required in the law. So they read about the scriptures, they're faithful, they provide the tithes, and who do the tithes go to? They go to the Levites. Remember the Levites, they didn't have an inheritance in the land. The Levites didn't have a role, they didn't have farms, they didn't do these things. And they were completely dependent upon the generosity of the other brothers and sisters in that congregation to give them of their wealth, to give them of their crops. And so they would receive these provisions, and then the Levites would then be able to devote themselves, as Ezra did, to the reading and understanding and teaching of the law, which then is brought to the people in the form of good teaching, which allows the people to be faithful, which allows God to provide the blessings so they can provide the tithes to the Levites. And you can see that it's all interrelated. And that's just how it is, brothers and sisters, in our ecclesia. It's such a joy for me when I have the opportunity. Jim, if you're away and I'm doing the announcements, and Kathy, you come up and say, these are all the things that, these are the people that we've talked to, and these are the people that need prayers. That's something that I don't do, but you do that so well. Is that the truth? Yes. And if you weren't there, that would fall down. And that's a role that you play that is so important in the ecclesia, and we all have roles like that. And when one of these things falls down, it creates problems, and that's what we see in the Old Testament. Because if the Levites aren't receiving the tithes, what does that mean? It means that they can't devote themselves to the teaching. Why? Because they got to go out into the farms. They got to go out into the fields. They've got to do something to earn enough to support their families. And when they're not teaching, and when they are neglecting those responsibilities, well, then the people don't know what it is they need to know to be faithful. And consequently, these people of faith now are unfaithful because they don't understand what God is requiring. And that means that as a nation, an unfaithful nation, God will no longer bless them, but he'll curse them, as Deuteronomy tells us. And the crops will fail. And that's what Peter was talking about last week, about how the crops were failing. We are all interdependent upon one another, brothers and sisters. And this then brings us to, I think, the main purpose of this second part of the book of Ezra. And so I asked the question, why is it, do you think, the book is named after Ezra? Well, it might be that he was the scribe who recorded everything, but I think it's more than that. The first 58 years in this book are chapters 1 through 7. I think it's more than that. 21 years plus another 58. These are all, the majority of the book of Ezra takes place in the first 6 years, in the first 6 chapters. The majority of the book of Ezra takes place in the first 6 chapters. And those chapters are about what? Rebuilding the temple. Now Ezra comes on the scene. And he's involved in rebuilding the temple. But it's a different temple. The first 6 chapters, part 1 of Ezra, are about the rebuilding of the physical temple. And in the second part of Ezra, chapters 7 through 10, we're reading about the rebuilding of the spiritual temple, the people. The New Testament tells us that we are living stones, that we are being built up into a spiritual temple. And that's the same as what's happening here in Jerusalem in the days of Ezra. And I think that we see this 2-part structure where we see these parallels. And the parallels are designed, I think, to cause us to realize that, wait a minute, we're seeing the same thing all over again in the second part. The difference is the temple's different. We're talking not about a temple that's made with bricks and mortar. We're talking about a temple that's being made with sinews and flesh and bone. And so just look at the parallels here. Chapters 1 through 6 begin with a decree, the decree of Cyrus. Chapter 7 begins with the decree of Artaxerxes. We talked about how gifts were given. The treasury, the gifts from the temple were given to Zerubbabel, and free will offerings. And we see the same free will offerings in the time when Ezra returns in chapter 7. Chapter 2 gives us a list of the names of everybody that returns. We see the same in Ezra chapter 8. Chapter 2 tells us that the return is led by Zerubbabel. Chapter 8 tells us the return is led by Ezra. Peter last week talked about how in the first 6 chapters the people were ministered to by the prophets, by... What is that?
My stomach.
You know, how the people are being ministered by Haggai and Zechariah. And in Ezra chapter 2, in the part 2, chapter 9, we see that Ezra is providing the ministrations. This intercessory ministration where he's praying to God on their behalf. So I think that's something that we really need to see. The focus, again, of the rebuilding in Ezra chapters 7 through 10 are on the spiritual temple. And this is what Peter has to say. And you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. What's more, you're his holy priests. Through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that are pleasing to God. And that's what we're here for, brothers and sisters. That's where Ezra was focusing his attention. The attention at this point in time is taking this people that had been in captivity for all of these years and floundering along, and now saying, okay, it's time for a reformation. And where do we get the reformation? We get it first and foremost through understanding what God is requiring of us. That's why it was so important for him to find the Levites to come back with him. That's why it was so important for him to be a priest who devoted himself to not only understanding the law, but being prepared to teach it. When we come to Nehemiah, we're going to see that Ezra gathered the people as one by a city gate. He constructed a stand on which he could speak to all of the people, and he taught them what the Scriptures said in their own language. See, for 70 years, they'd lived in Babylon. You wonder how much of the language, how much of the reading in Israel could they still do? And so Ezra and the scribes and the Levites and the priests taught the people. Why? To rebuild that spiritual temple. So it's 10:15. Let me show you what I hope to do next week. One of the big problems that they discover is that there are a number of the Jews who have intermarried. They have married wives from the Canaanite nations who are causing these Jews, worshipers of Yahweh, to be tempted to go back to worshiping idolatrous gods. And this was a huge issue. The issue was that the people were brought into captivity originally because of their idolatrous worship. After the return from Babylon, they never worshipped physical idols again. But there was a real danger that they might. And God said that they would destroy them if they worshipped idols. And so they looked out and they saw that in their midst there were people who were idol worshipers. Maybe not Jews themselves, but it was a danger. And so Ezra learns of this, and he mourns publicly, and he prays on behalf of the people. And they try and decide what it is that they need to do in order to make things right. And from this part in Ezra chapter 9 through much of Nehemiah, we see the beginnings of this rebuilding of the spiritual temple. And so, God willing, that's what we'll cover next week. Any questions or comments before we close? Yeah.
I heard on the radio, I think, that people today, if they're Jewish, most of them that know which tribe it was the tribe of Levi. And other tribes, nobody seems to know.
That's true. So there are two tribes that I think Jews can point their genealogy to more than others. One is the priests, which I suppose is Levi. So the surname Cohen.
Right.
So Cohen is a Jewish surname, and that would be relating to the priests. And then the Jewish surname Levitt is one that would refer to the Levites. I know you know some families by the name of Levitt, right? I mean, I never, until I was doing the study, it never dawned on me, oh, Levitt, Levites. That's where they draw.
Right across the street from us.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting? Okay. So genealogy was important. And earlier in Ezra, remember, there was a time where there were some priests that couldn't prove their genealogy. And so what happened? They weren't allowed to serve as priests. That's how important it was. Okay.